ter. Don't worry. Sorry. Wrong page. So, first of all, welcome to FLAD. Bem-vindos à FLAD. Meu nome é Rita Faden e sou presidente da FLAD, Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento. So, now in English, everyone, welcome to FLAD. It is a pleasure to have you here and to continue this series that we have started and we call Democracy, the Way Ahead. As many as you know, since January, we have been bringing international experts to discuss with us the challenges that our democracies are facing today. And some of you have been here in our previous sections, so it's a pleasure and welcome back to FLAD. In the first two sessions, we have focused our attention mainly on external challenges. We have discussed how democracies must work together to uphold the rules-based international order, and how Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's rise test those values and challenge the current world order and the free world. But the future of the world order and our future is not only influenced by foreign policy or global developments. They are also a result of transformations that happen within our countries and within our societies. That's why we also need to discuss the political landscape in the United States and the challenges its democracy faces ahead of the 2024 general election, presidential election. This election will be watched all over the world because it has implications for all of us. As lots of us say, we should be able to vote for those elections, as we are very much impacted by their result. This is why we invited Susan Glasser and Peter Baker. Susan Glasser is staff writer at The New Yorker, and Peter Baker is chief White House correspondent at The New York Times. And the conversation will be moderated by Pedro Magalhães. At FLAD, we maintain the same objective with this series, Democracy, the Way Ahead. We want to promote an informed debate on this crucial issue because we believe we all have a part to play in defending our democracies. Thank you so much for being here. And now the floor is yours.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Agradeço muito o convite que a FLAD me dirigiu para vir moderar esta conversa. Eu vou dizer só algumas palavras sobre os nossos convidados e vou passar para inglês, que é para eles saberem que eu não estou a dizer nada de errado sobre eles. So Susan Glasser writes for The New Yorker. She's a staff writer there. She writes an online column called Letter from Biden's Washington. She started at the Washington Post. She edited the Post Sunday Outlook there and several national news sections. She oversaw the Washington Post's coverage of Bill Clinton's impeachment, covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And besides all of this, and I'm really summarizing, she was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy until later she joined Politico. So we have someone here that has very close and deep knowledge of U.S. politics in the last 20 years at least. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He's responsible for... Eu penso que o meu som está a falhar recorrentemente. Espero que a culpa não seja minha. Vou deixar aqui. Ouvem bem neste momento? Sim, sim. So, as I was saying, Peter Baker has covered 5 presidents already, and he's now, of course, the chief White House correspondent for New York Times. As I said, he has covered some of the most momentous events in U.S. politics, which means world politics, in the last 3 decades. The original story, breaking the Ken Starr investigation of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the impeachment of President Trump, the invasion of Iraq. He has won every single award that a white correspondent can win. And besides all this, Susan and Peter are the true, in the proper sense of the word, power couple. So they're married, They've spent 4 years as Moscow bureau chiefs for the Post. They chronicled the rise of Vladimir Putin, what happened afterwards, the rollback of Russian democracy, the Chechen War. They have written several books together. Let me just stress 3 of them. Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. Also, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James Baker III, and more recently, a book called The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017-2021. So thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with kind of a soft question. We'll see where this goes. Maybe I'll start with Susan.
I get the soft questions. She gets the hard questions.
We'll get there.
Okay, all right.
So I wanted to ask you, just to start our conversation, if we had to think about what have been like the most successful moments or the most successful accomplishments of the Biden administration, but also the not so successful events, what would you select?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Pedro, for that generous introduction. Thank you to FLAD for hosting us here, a really terrific group of people, and I think a terrific series of speakers and different viewpoints that you've expressed. And I do think it's important. I often hear that traveling around the world. People pay such close attention to U.S. politics, and I think that's a way that I would answer your question, because really in recent years, if you think about it, Washington has been, somebody put it to me at the very beginning of Trump's presidency, the epicenter of global instability. It's not, you want to care about foreign policy. I was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, as you mentioned. In many ways, that's still where my interests lie. And yet the truth of the matter is, if you're interested in foreign policy and international relations today, your attention naturally must go to the internal politics of the United States and arguably to other Western democracies. I actually believe that the biggest threat to Western democracy right now comes from what's happening within our own countries. And so you asked me, what's the great accomplishment of the Biden administration? I would say its existence is the great accomplishment. What happened on January 20th, 2021, in any other time in our history, we would say, well, that's just, ceremonial. It doesn't have any meaning. It had meaning this time. It had real meaning, because we had a situation where, for the first time in American history, we've had many great moments of division. And I actually think it's not right to say that this is the most divided that America's ever been. I was born just after the disruptions of 1968 in America, which were big in America just as they were in parts of Europe. There was, of course, the great division of the U.S. Civil War. So I don't say that this is the most divided we've ever been, but it was the first time in American history that we had an American president who refused to accept the outcome of a lawful election, who refused to concede defeat and to leave office peacefully. And so, actually, I do think that the greatest accomplishment of Joe Biden was, taking the oath of office.
Yeah. Do you make the same assessment?
I agree with everything she said.
Of course.
Just to be clear. No, I think that's right. Since she did the positive, I'll do the negative. The negative would be that, and you can say whether it's his fault or not, he promised to restore normalcy, to unify the country again. And it may be that no president could do that, but he hasn't done that. I mean, he has obviously successfully gotten some bipartisan legislation through. That's something we hadn't seen in a while. He got infrastructure and semiconductors and Veterans Affairs bills through with Republican support. And he has normalized Washington to some extent. There is at least more of the trappings that we used to have prior to Trump, in which, Republicans and Democrats would at least talk and not always be completely at war with each other. But the country is still as divided as it ever was. Now, Republicans would say that's his fault, that he's too mean to MAGA Republicans. Democrats would scoff at that and say the real issue, of course, is Trump, who refuses to lead the scene. But either way you look at it, the country is as polarized as it's ever been. In the context that Susan just said, it's not what it was in '68 or certainly the 19th century. But we have not become unified under Joe Biden, and I think he would like us to be, but it's not worked out.
Let me ask a question about, you use the term polarization. I always tell my students, if they want to get successful grants, there are two words they need to have there. One is polarization, the other is populism. But let me ask you a little bit about this. Polarization kind of assumes that both sides are moving away from each other and to the extremes. But on the other hand, it seems that although probably the Democrats have moved a little bit to the left, one could say what we really have is a radicalization of the Republicans. I mean, maybe I wanted to ask you if I'm being biased, or if European observers who always tend to see things a little like this. Is this a biased view of things? It seems that the policy agenda of the Democrats may have moved a bit to the left. But for example, the Republicans now in Congress, they are really about challenging the system as a whole. Is this a good assessment, or is it radicalization of one side, or polarization with both sides moving away from each other?
Well, if you're asking me to start, I mean, I would say that you make some really important points there. There's no question that on a policy level, the Republicans have moved further to the right than the Democrats probably have moved to the left on particular issues. As you say, there is this sense, certainly by Trump, and at least by some of his supporters, of blowing up the system, as you were. There is the reaction on the left to at least some people on the left want to do the same thing. When the Supreme Court was, moved Republican because Trump got 3 justices, there was a move on the part of some Democrats to say, well, let's pack the court then. Yeah. Let's add 6 more justices or 5 justices and put liberals on there to overwhelm it. That would be an example of blowing up the system. Now, it didn't go very far. Joe Biden isn't into that. That's different. The leadership of the Democratic Party is not willing to blow up the system in the way the leadership, if you count Donald Trump as the leadership of the Republican Party, is willing to blow it up. In terms of polarization, though, I do think that it's not even necessarily where the ideology is moving or the policies are moving. It's just our inability and unwillingness, perhaps, to share a common view of the world at this point. When Susan and I were growing up in Washington, I grew up in Washington, Susan grew up in New Jersey, there were 3 major television networks and a handful of newspapers, and everybody started off with the same fact set. And then we argued about what to do about it, right? Should we do this on healthcare or that on taxes? Today, we all live in our own separate universes. Because of the fragmentation of the media, because of the advent of social media, we can live with people who only agree with us and never have to listen to, much less have any respect for people who don't agree with us. This is both a physical, geographical phenomenon in which we are more and more living with people who agree with us and not with people who don't agree with us. It's also a metaphysical one. The polls in the 1960s asked the question, would it bother you if your son or daughter married somebody from the other political party? And back then the answer was around 5% or so. Today, the answer is closer to 50%. I don't want no Republican showing up at my Thanksgiving table. I don't want no Democrat coming for Christmas. I mean, we don't even want to be with each other. And so it used to be a vigorous and often very tough democracy in which we didn't agree and we did fight and we did have it out, has become so toxic that we now believe the other side is evil and not even willing to listen to them. Yeah. And that may be more true on the Republican side or on the right, but it's not entirely exclusive to the left either.
I mean, besides listening to what you had to say about this issue, I wanted to go further because you mentioned the Supreme Court. And of course, the decision about abortion rights was followed all over the world. And I wanted to ask you, these proposals to, for example, change the composition of the court or increase the composition of the court or abolish life tenure, is there some momentum here, or is this just going to fail?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to sort of dig into here. What I would say is that I think your insight is a very important insight about the radicalization of the Republican Party. In part, we have struggled, and we as journalists have struggled because the two-party system is so deeply ingrained in how we think about American politics, certainly how we cover American politics. And of course, this equivalence, false equivalence, as it happens, I think is something that Republicans have used to their benefit. Even the basic terminology, that we're all used to when it comes to American politics is increasingly not really operative. For example, is it really fair to say that Republicans have moved right and Democrats have moved left? I think the notion of conservatism, it's hard to see what Republicans are advancing now, certainly the kind of ideas that Donald Trump is advancing, they're not really very conservative, are they? They're actually very disruptive, they're very radical. You tend to think of conservatives as people who, want things to stay stable. They want things to stay the same. And so I think that I prefer the term, radical at times. And of course, we've had previous periods in our history when that was the case as well. And so I think that's part of it. And one thing that's important to say, too, is that this period of intense polarization and partisanship, it predates Donald Trump. It's not all his fault. And in fact, a couple of friends of ours, I think, wrote a very prescient book about the U.S. Congress and polarization, in which they pointed out that it actually was the Republican Party in Congress that increasingly was focused on essentially burning down the institution, grinding it to a halt, being willing to do things, as you're about to see this summer, to hold up basic functioning of the government. Right now, there's a big fight brewing in Washington over raising the U.S. debt ceiling, which should be it's not a big policy argument, because in the end, neither Democrats nor Republicans want the U.S. to go out of business. So presumably they both ultimately have to agree upon this, and yet there's one party that has consistently taken things like that hostage. So that predates Donald Trump. You can blame him for a lot of things, but I don't think you can blame him for what really has been a long-term trend of the two parties pulling farther and farther away from each other. However, Trump, as we called our book, The Divider, he is an accelerant of change. He seeks out the divisions in American society and seeks to widen them. In that sense, we are in a very different, I think, and worse place than we were, say, in 2015, before this happened. And, to your question about the Supreme Court, we are now having a conversation that I think is very different than the one that we would have been having even a few years ago. First of all, Donald Trump was able to get 3 Supreme Court justices in a very short amount of time, in a single presidential term, in part by what many historians, I think, are likely to judge as an abuse of power on the part of Republicans. Remember that it was the Senate Republicans who, in 2016, refused to allow Democrats to confirm a Supreme Court justice. He wouldn't even have a hearing on Merrick Garland's nomination. If you combine that with pushing through a Supreme Court nominee literally weeks, practically days before the 2020 presidential election, which Republicans lost, you have a situation where Republicans abused their power in order to radically change the composition of one of the most powerful institutions in American life. And the result, of course, is the repeal of Roe versus Wade, as well as many other things. Now, the New York Times pointed out this morning that confidence in the Supreme Court as an institution is really at a historic low. I think it was something like 25% of Americans only expressed confidence in the Supreme Court in a Gallup survey last year. That's a very worrisome number, because we've seen trust in our institutions across the board plummet in recent years. Obviously, the media, everybody hates us, but it's not just the media. It's not just politicians. And so I don't know what the right way forward is. I actually don't think that these calls are very serious on the left to expand the court or anything like that. It's not going to happen. It's a non-starter. But I think we're headed for a period of accelerating fragmentation, and I've seen no signs in the last 2.5 years that this long-term trend is reversing itself.
I wanted to ask you about, I hope this is not boring for the audience, but I think it's a very important issue directly related to not only the vision but also to democracy. One thing that most Europeans have a really hard time understanding about the US is how decentralized the electoral process is and the electoral rules are.
Yeah.
In Portugal, we have a national electoral committee, we have national legislation, and I think that what we are seeing in the last couple of years is a lot of changes taking place at the state level that, I mean, really raise the issue or start raising the issue of electoral integrity in the United States. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that this is a danger? And I mean, even further than this, losers' consent is like a basic element of any democracy. Do you see this in danger as a result of particular processes taking place in different states, in different jurisdictions in the U.S.?
Well, I think you're right to point out that we have a federal system in which the 50 states decide for themselves their election laws and how voting proceeds within certain parameters. There are parameters that the federal system requires every state to meet, and that has been a big battleground lately. There obviously are efforts in a number of red states and states run by Republicans to limit voting hours, to limit opportunities to vote, to cull the voting rolls. They are seen certainly by many as, in some cases at least racially oriented, targeting more disenfranchised people in society who might be perceived as voting for Democrats. And that was a huge fight in the first year of Biden's term, as an example. Having said that, none of that seemed to actually play out in the 22 midterm elections. For all the fears that these new laws would somehow stop people from voting, it didn't seem to, okay? So in the short term, that has not accomplished or achieved the worst fears that the critics had. The larger question, I think, you touched on, which is the belief in the system, right? This idea that we accept the results and we say, if we lose, we lose, and we'll come back next time, we'll try harder and do a better job, that's at risk here. And that is the more corrosive, to me, danger right now in American democracy, because Donald Trump has convinced 60, 70% of Republicans that something went wrong in the 2020 election that defrauded him and stole the election. It's not true. This is not an opinion. No evidence, I will say zero evidence, let me repeat that, no evidence is out there that anything happened in the 2020 election that would have changed the outcome, period. That's just not, it's not a bias, it's not a Democrat-Republican point of view. That's just all the factual investigations, including by Republicans, by the way, have found no evidence that there was anything wrong in the 2020 election that would have changed the outcome, including, by the way, by Trump's own campaign team, his own campaign lawyers. His own campaign hired a firm to look for these things and came back and said, no, there's nothing wrong. His own attorney general.
But the issue is that so many people believe
this is
that something happened.
And if you don't accept it, if 70% of one party doesn't accept that the election is legitimate, you have lost something really important in a democracy. So that, to me, is the longer-term, bigger, more dangerous trend in American politics.
So we were talking just before we came here. 20 years ago, people are already talking about polarization, but nobody really thought that these kinds of dangers. Do you see a danger as well? Do you see for the next election what will happen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Will losers' consent exist?
That's right. Look, we are in a crisis, period, full stop. I know that many people expected, including many journalists, that the election of 2020 would be the end of the crisis, or at least Biden's inauguration would be the end of the crisis. It didn't turn out that way. It was a reasonable assumption, but it was wrong. And the reason is because millions and millions of Republicans refuse to accept the legitimate results of an election. And many of them now endorse the use of violence to change the result of an election. And they are willing to believe lies and propaganda. This is very cynical. You have a trial beginning in the United States today against Fox News. And Dominion Voting Systems, which is the voting machines, is suing Fox News for $1.6 billion. And the evidence that has been coming out as in part of this lawsuit is really extraordinary, because it shows, what you might have suspected to be the case, but it's really amazing to see it in writing. It shows that it was a cynical plot, essentially, on the part of the owners, executives, and anchors of Fox News to spread Donald Trump's lies to their own audience, and they knew that it was untrue. They knew that it was a joke. They knew that there was no evidence, as Peter said, and yet they got millions and millions of people to believe this. And their motivation for doing this, which of course will now be at issue in this lawsuit, it appears that their motivation for doing this was simply commercial, that their motivation was they were afraid of their own audience, who really preferred the lie to the truth. And that's the big risk for democracy. And that is something I also want to say, because Peter and I, as you pointed out, spent 4 years covering Russia and the former Soviet Union. And essentially, I see that in the United States and in many Western countries, we're being forced to arguably to relearn some of the lessons of that period of time. The struggle of democracy is a struggle of truth against lies on some basic level. And, for us as journalists, when you had a president of the United States, who all presidents don't like the press. I'm sure that's true in Portugal as well, right? Nobody likes the bearers of bad news. And that's not a partisan phenomenon. But we've never had a president of the United States who spoke publicly of journalists as the enemies of the people. And, maybe some of you here have some experience with Russia and the former Soviet Union. The term vrag naroda, enemy of the people, this was Stalin's term that was used to condemn millions of people to the gulag. Donald Trump, not a very historically savvy person, but certainly was told, that this was the connotation. This was a word and a phrase only used by the world's worst dictators. And he chose to use it hundreds of times in the course of his presidency. And so I do actually think that some of the crisis that we're having is about very simple questions of the role of truth and propaganda in a democracy.
But I mean, this is probably not a very fair question, because millions of pages have been written about this, more will be, but you wrote many yourselves. What explains Trump in the sense that people have this, when he appeared, he would never be able to challenge, the Republican establishment. He did. You'll never be able to win the election. He did. After, the events before the inauguration, he's over, right? This is his complete legitimization. But he's still there. Casting his shadow in American politics. So what explains this? I know this is unfair, but...
That's the next event. We'll come back for that.
Yeah. All unfair questions go to Susan. But I would say that, look, you're right. Everybody has underestimated him all along, from the beginning of his political career in 2015, if we as the beginning, through today. He has been counted out repeatedly. He can't possibly survive the terrible comment he made about John McCain's war record. He can't survive what he said about the Muslim father of a slain American soldier. He can't survive Access Hollywood or the Charlottesville comments or January 6th. And he has. And he survived last fall's midterm elections, which didn't go very well for Republicans. And all Republicans said, well, it's all Donald Trump's fault. And then it doesn't matter because they're still supporting him. He has a visceral connection with his base that has been inalterable and undamaged no matter what factual set may come along. As Susan has pointed out repeatedly, his approval rating started out around 40-some% when he got into the presidency. It is still around 40-some%. Everything that has happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years has not changed that even one bit. COVID didn't, 2 impeachments didn't, January 6th didn't. All of these things did not change his core base. Why is that, is your question, and it's still the central question of our day. He is channeling an us versus them moment where the people who are for him are, it's not about policy, it's not about tax cuts or even protectionism or all the different specific issues he may raise. Some of them are more visceral than others, like immigration, obviously, is a pretty powerful force in his appeal, but it is more about the sense of tribalism. And he is us and they are them, and they can be anybody. It can be Democrats, it could be Republicans, by the way, establishment Republicans. He makes them the enemy as well. It can be about race, it can be about immigration, it can be about money, it can be about class, it can be about elites, it can be about the coasts. Never mind that the leader of this movement is a New York billionaire with gold fixtures on his airplane. His own private airplane. Somehow he is not the elite, he is the champion of, and it has been, you have to give him credit for his ability to somehow translate that background into the champion of populism, and yet that's the case. And so it's not, you're not going to beat him with specific issues. It is all about the sense of us versus them that he has channeled somehow very successfully.
I know a lot of people here are interested in foreign policy as well, and I wanted to touch just a couple of issues before I give the word to the audience. Moving to a different character, you guys wrote a book about Putin as well. So I guess the first question
We get all the
is,
fun ones.
Yes. So the developments of the last year and a half, I mean, how surprised were you by what ultimately happened?
Yeah, well, that's right. We wrote 3 books together, and one was Vladimir Putin and one was Donald Trump. So obviously Jim Baker is our favorite subject. Look, Peter and I were in Moscow at the very beginning of the Trump era. And in fact, actually, our dear friend Anna Nemtsova is here today, who worked with us throughout those whole 4 years in Russia and has been welcomed here in Portugal since, the horrors of last February. I would say it's in some ways, it's like Donald Trump. It's shocking, but it shouldn't be that surprising. And, I find myself resorting to that formula oftentimes when it's come to American politics in the last few years. But I think you could apply that same formula to the story of Putin and, the years of testing our boundaries of aggression. One thing is that, Vladimir Putin is not a first-time abuser here, right? This is not the first war that he's launched. We talk a lot about China these days in American foreign policy. I think it's worth noting that China has not engaged in a major military conflict since 1979 and a war with Vietnam, whereas that's not the case with Russia. Vladimir Putin came to power arguably through the use of force in Chechnya, inside Russia, as it happened. He has repeatedly sought to relitigate through military means things that he could not achieve through political or diplomatic ends. And we saw that with Georgia, of course. We've seen it in his assistance, his successful assistance to Assad in Syria in the last few years. And we've seen it starting in 2014 with Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, I think, again, not entirely dissimilarly from Donald Trump, has often told us what he thinks and what he's going to do. We've had a really hard time listening to Donald Trump. When someone tells you, and to Vladimir Putin, when someone tells you who they are, right? The biggest challenge is to listen, is to understand what they're saying. And it was in 2005 that Vladimir Putin first said the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. He did not have the capacity that he has today to march on his neighbor with 190,000 men. There's another Russian phrase that sometimes comes to mind when you think of Putin early on: the appetite grows while eating. Yeah. Vladimir Putin in 2005, was not relitigating the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he was telling us that he was prepared to. He has become radicalized in a way that makes it very, very hard to see any outcome of the war that's possible as long as he remains in power. When you say not only that my neighbor is bad, but that he doesn't have the right to exist, it's very hard to imagine negotiating with someone who says you don't have the right to exist. And so in our internal politics, I particularly fear this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric. So recently Donald Trump was talking about his campaign, and he said, this is the ultimate battle for the United States. This next election will determine whether we have a country at all. And it's apocalyptic, right? Very hard to sit down again at the table with someone who holds those views. And I think the same thing applies, especially when you look at the horrific toll, in lives and blood and treasure in Ukraine.
So my next to last question, it's to try to connect this foreign policy issue with U.S. domestic politics. Of course, Republicans and Democrats, Republican Democratic presidents always had somewhat different foreign policies. But what would the Republican presidency look like dealing with the Ukraine issue? Because that's something that when you start listening, I'm leaving Trump aside, when you start listening to some of the statements by Republican leaders, you get the sense that probably they would not be doing exactly the same as the Biden administration.
No, it's a good question. It's an important question because up until now, the support for Ukraine in Washington has been more or less bipartisan. Most Republicans in Congress have supported these big aid packages. Some of them, like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leaders, say, in fact, it should be bigger, that Biden isn't doing enough, that Biden is holding back, and he should be more supportive of Ukraine. But you're beginning to see that bipartisan consensus fraying at the edges, on the left and on the right. More on the right now, but also a little bit on the left. And what's really telling is not just that Donald Trump says, I think Putin is a genius, which he did say in February of last year before the invasion, and just this week said he's a top-of-the-line, really smart guy. It's that Ron DeSantis has now agreed with him. Ron DeSantis, of course, is the #1 challenger at the moment to Trump for the Republican nomination. And DeSantis says, well, that Ukraine thing is just a territorial dispute, and we don't have any real interest in that all. And the fact that DeSantis decided that he needed to say that in order to match Trump in his skepticism of the bipartisan policy toward Ukraine means that roughly 85% of the two candidates who control 85% roughly of the Republican electorate at the moment, both are saying, if we become president, we're not going to be for Ukraine the same way that Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden are. So that means that come next year, when we have this election really going at full tilt, there's not going to be the same consensus in Washington. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin and you're back in the Kremlin, what are you going to get out of this? The answer's pretty obvious, right? I may just have to wait it out. Because in January 2025, there may be a different president, and maybe I don't have to worry so much. And so if I can keep this thing going just long enough to wait out the Americans, and that they pull out, maybe the Europeans aren't quite so strong either, and the Ukrainians suddenly are left without friends. So that's the calculation going on, and that's why even though right now it is still strong in Washington on a bipartisan level, it's that message that's being sent that has real consequences.
The last question about China. Of course, Joe Biden is extremely different from Donald Trump. But one of the interesting, I wouldn't say continuities, maybe it's even a stronger stance, is that the position of the American government vis-a-vis China has changed very much in comparison, let's say, with Obama.
Absolutely. A decade ago, there was just a radically different view of China, and the idea remained of a sort of an integration of China with global institutions, with this idea that by doing so, you would eventually affect both the security situation and also potentially even the domestic situation. Obviously, that no longer applies. And, you've seen almost a bipartisan consensus develop that China, far from being a responsible stakeholder, increasingly is a long-term threat and competitor and adversary of the United States. And so this is what the Biden administration came in saying. It's not that different from what senior officials in the Trump administration were saying. Now, Trump himself, of course, has his own foreign policy, and it doesn't always agree with that of the officials who worked for him. And just the other day, Peter referenced Trump in an interview saying that Vladimir Putin was top of the line. He also waxed poetic in that same interview about Xi Jinping. And he said he's very bright, top of the line guy, top of his game. He and I had good relations. We got along really well. That being said, their policies were not that different. And I think what you're seeing, if anything, I've started to hear people in sort of the foreign policy world saying, whoa, just what are we prepared to actually do here? Because, there are some, there was a U.S. general recently quoted as saying that it might be as soon as in the next few years that China would be prepared to move even militarily to take over Taiwan. The United States is not ready, and Taiwan are not ready to deal with that militarily. And in fact, our budgets do not envision anything like that in the short to medium term. And so I think right now you have a situation where the rhetoric about the policy has outpaced arguably the capacity of the United States to follow through on that policy. And of course, China is much more integrated with the world economy, with global supply chains, and specifically with the U.S. economy. Russia's economy is much, much smaller than China's, and also much, much farther away from having any real bearing on the U.S. economy. You know, the U.S. could stop doing business with Russia, and it really wouldn't be that big of an economic issue. It's a bigger issue for Europe, of course. But, you know, it's a problem of a totally different scale. And so I would say that the next few years are going to be a period of adjustment. The difference is that Trump is more, I would say, disruptive and unpredictable. You know, Biden, as you've seen, is fundamentally a president for whom alliance management is a core. It's actually a belief. It's not just a process for Biden and his administration. I think it's actually their foreign policy belief is that a country is strong in the world if it has strong friendships and strong partnerships. That is almost the exact opposite of Donald Trump's view. And, you know, I know we're going to take questions now, so I think where I would end up is that actually, if you want to know the biggest difference for me in terms of covering the Trump presidency versus any of the others, Democrat or Republican, I've seen, it's to have a president of the United States who fundamentally admires America's adversaries, admires the world's worst authoritarians, and is consistently a critic of its allies. I don't believe that there is any precedent in American history for this. And I think in some ways it is a simple, elemental truth that is often overlooked. And we tend to make things more complex. But if you want to know about foreign policy, there is an enormous difference, even though some of the narrow things might not be so different, between having a president who admires Vladimir Putin and thinks he's a genius, and every other American president of my lifetime or your lifetime.
Thank you very much. So we can now open for questions. At my institute, we have a rule after the seminars. The first questions always come from the students. So I cannot identify the students here, but the first questions need to come from under 35s. I'll give time to everybody else, but please, the younger people, can you start? And I'm very liberal about the concept of young, right? 35 is very liberal. Please go ahead.
Well, hi. Is this on? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful. My question goes a little, not as much in the direction that you guys went, but when I think about threats to democracy, I get very worried about the media. And one thing that worries me, first of all, is the apathy of younger people towards media. Oh, I can get my news from, I don't know, Twitter. And, you know, it's kind of weird. And I wanted to know, how do you guys feel about that panorama in the States, especially from the youth? And how, I mean, because maybe it's about growing into it. So when you guys were younger, how did you feel like the youth was interested in that? And then the second thing that I wanted to ask that really worries me is about digital media. Because, for instance, I've seen, and even in the New York Times, I'm sorry, but I've seen news being edited in a way that they disappear, or where they were going changes. And, you know, there's this one thing about press media, written media, that you cannot erase what you said. So I don't know if China, for instance, that already censors, you know, its own media, if they decide to change the narrative or change the story, how what this digital media can lead us to in terms of fake news and suppression.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's a lot of good questions. And thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming. Yeah, you know, when I was a kid, I hated Twitter. So it's different today. Look, yeah, you're absolutely right about the younger generation, and the real test for the media is to engage our younger readers, our younger potential readers, and to explain and make clear to them why it matters that there's a difference between the New York Times and the New Yorker on the one hand, and something I just might find on the internet on the other, right? We have to, so our test and our mission these last number of years of the New York Times has been to reinforce the brand. And by that we mean that the idea that you see something that says it's from the New York Times means that you can trust it, that you can believe in it, that you can, you know, rely on it for being factual and true, and when we get things wrong, and we do get things wrong, that we will correct them, okay? Now, you mentioned changing things on web. I'm not 100% sure what you mean. In my experience, the only time we change a story that is online is is A, if we have it wrong, in which case we append a correction to it, or B, if it's a breaking story, in which case we're adding to it as we go because we're learning more things. You know, there was a missile that fired at Kyiv today, and we give you 3 or 4 paragraphs just saying that, and then as the story develops, we give you more. So we're not supposed to be changing a story, certainly not in reaction to anything a government might tell us to do. But you're right to be concerned about sources of information. We learned just the other day that Russia believes that only 1% of the bots that it has put out there disseminating disinformation have actually been caught by the social media companies. Now, let's just say they're bragging and they're exaggerating that, fine. But let's just say it's only 10% or even 20%. That means 80% of what Russia is doing out there for disinformation, we're not catching. That, you know, that Facebook and Google and all these others are not catching, and it is out there. So it's incumbent on younger Americans and younger Europeans and younger people all over the world to be taking seriously where they get their information from. And I hope that younger generation will help educate their friends and their classmates and their contemporaries that they shouldn't just trust anything they get online. We had a friend of ours, a very good friend of ours, who was worried about taking these vaccines when the COVID vaccines came out. And she comes up to me and she said, well, see here, look at this thing I found on the web. It says vaccines can be bad. I said, okay, can you show that to me? Look, what is the site? Oh, let's look at the site. It's scandal.com. Okay, scandal.com may not be your most reliable news source. And so on some level, we as readers have a responsibility ourselves to seek out news sources that we can trust and have a record of trustworthiness.
More questions from young Europeans? Go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your inputs. It was really interesting. I wanted to know, you were talking about that Putin might be looking into what the next president of the United States might do. But I think that if the US retreats its support from what's happening in Ukraine, that it might be seen as a weakness, especially after Afghanistan and all of that. So I wanted to know, what do you think would make the United States take back the support?
Yeah. I think you're right that it would be perceived as a form of weakness, and that's why I started today with this idea of the United States as the epicenter of global instability. It's what's happening inside our own country. Because if we can change our foreign policy every 2 years or every 4 years based on our elections, it's very hard to operate as a global superpower. And we already saw that recently. You know, Obama negotiated, worked on the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What is the first thing that Trump came in and did? He undid all of those things. He withdrew from Paris, although we're back in it now. He withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We never did go back to that. He withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. Biden came into office and tried and could not go back to the same deal that he had negotiated as part of the Obama administration. And so, you know, you really can't be a global superpower if you can't operate in a world where people can trust your word. And so I think we're already actually in that crisis, right? I think it's not theoretical. I think it's actual. And this uncertainty about our commitments is now probably a permanent factor in international relations going forward. And so to your specific question about the war in Ukraine, you know, I think that right now there remains a bipartisan majority in the U.S. Congress, in both the House and the Senate, that is committed to continuing to give assistance to Ukraine, but it's not clear how long that will be the case for. And the truth is that Donald Trump does not support Ukraine. He has not supported it for a really long time, actually going back well to the very beginning of his administration. There's an amazing scene that we recount in our book in the spring of 2017. That's at the very beginning of his presidency, and he has the previous president of Ukraine come to his office, Petro Poroshenko, and he tells the president of Ukraine in the Oval Office, "You are not the president of a real country. Ukraine is not a real country." I know a lot of people told me that. Some people in Florida told me that.
And he went after the ambassador, the American ambassador to Ukraine, right?
Correct.
She was...
He then later wanted to fire her, and in fact, she was in that meeting, and she recounts that story in the memoir that she ultimately did. My point is that it's not even a short-term bias against Ukraine, but a very genuine belief that Trump seems to have that he shares with Vladimir Putin. It's not that he's neutral in this war. He is in favor of Putin. He's in favor of Russia in this war. Now, Americans are not. Okay, so right now, Americans certainly are very supportive of Ukraine, and that is bipartisan, more or less. But the political momentum in this country, as Peter pointed out, is in the other direction on the Republican side. So I think it's something that's a real threat to Ukraine, frankly. I think that people have not recognized how serious that problem is.
More questions now open to anyone. I see a hand there. There was the first hand I saw. You over there? And then...
Still looks under 35.
Okay.
Good.
So I wanted to ask you about the conflict in Ukraine. We have seen so far three important players. Of course, Russia, the United States, and also somehow China. But I wanted to ask you, recently it seems that also Brazil is becoming a player in this conflict. Lavrov recently went to Brazil. Lula has criticized the United States for his support to Ukraine, and also I read in the news that Vladimir Putin invited Lula to go to Brazil and discuss the economic relationships between the two countries and also the war in Ukraine. So my question is, do you think that Brazil, the role of Brazil in this conflict is becoming more and more, like gradually, similar to the role China has?
It's a great question, actually. And I think that what you're seeing is Russia looking for allies at a time when it feels more isolated, right? And because Lula has expressed some more sympathetic views, he's more than willing to Putin is more than willing to then recruit him, enlist him, woo him, and make him an ally. I don't know how much that matters. In other words, what they're looking for, what Russia needs, Ukraine has better allies right now, right? Like, if you're in this conflict, you'd rather have Europe and the United States than you'd like to have Iran, North Korea, China. Because right now, Russia's not getting from them what Ukraine is getting from the West, right? Ukraine is getting weaponry, it's getting intelligence assistance, it's getting economic assistance, finances to run its government, humanitarian assistance. And what is China providing Russia? What is Brazil providing Russia? Pretty much nothing, right? I mean, China's buying more of their oil, but they didn't give them the big pipeline that they wanted yet. They're not giving them the heavy weaponry that they want. So Russia is left to buy drones from Iran, of all places, and North Korea possibly. I don't think Lula has that kind of an industry to supply Russia with what it needs. So what is he getting it from? He's getting political help. He can pretend that there is, in fact, sort of two axes in the world right now. There's the Western, pro-Ukraine, pro-Europe, pro-American axis, and then there's the Russia-China, global South axis. And that's important. Not to minimize that by any stretch. But again, if I were Ukraine, I would rather have the guys who are shipping me weapons and giving me intelligence about where to use them than the other way around.
Thanks. So I had Raquel over there.
Thank you. Thank you both for a very interesting discussion, and thank you, Pedro, for these wonderful questions. I wanted to focus on one of the members of this administration, the Vice President, Kamala Harris. We focus a lot on the President for obvious reasons. I think that I'm a particular enthusiast of all the diplomacy by Antony Blinken. I mean, it's been long since we had such a good Secretary of State. I mean, the quality of the diplomats that he's bringing in, Bridget Brink in Ukraine, the new ambassador to Russia, finally an ambassador to India. A lot of things are happening in that regard. But It seems to me, and this is my question, maybe I'm being a bit unfair, but my perception of Kamala Harris is a kind of a missing in action from a political point of view. And that is important because in terms of the succession, she's number 2, but also because there have been some efforts. Her recent trip to African countries, to 3 African countries, true. But is this an unfair perception, one? And secondly, is she good for the ticket for the next election?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways you've cut right to the heart of the matter, and Peter and I have managed to ramble on for an hour without ever getting to the heart of the matter so succinctly. So, I think that the premise behind your question is absolutely correct, and in many ways, had Joe Biden been more successful in his choice of vice president, probably he wouldn't be, running again for president. One of the reasons that Biden is running for president is because it's very clear that he has not managed to pick a successor who would have the united support of the Democratic Party, and that this really matters at a moment when Donald Trump is the front runner for the Republican nomination. Democrats simply, for many understandable reasons, are not willing to risk a situation where they have a weak nominee. And so, Biden's argument for why is he running for re-election at the age of 80, and that means, again, not how he is today, but imagine how he would be at the end of his second term. He would be 86 years old. Yeah. And I'm sure many of us, have fathers, grandfathers who've experienced this. When you are 85, 86 years old, your health can deteriorate very rapidly in the course of just a few months. We have had 2 recent examples just in the last few weeks in Washington. We have had the 81-year-old Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. He tripped going into a fundraiser at a hotel in Washington. He was out of commission for weeks in the hospital with a concussion, then in rehabilitation. He's back at work now, but who's to say? There's another senator in her 80s, Dianne Feinstein, who's unable to show up for work, and it stopped all of Biden's judicial nominees cold, basically. Yeah. There's no way to proceed. And so I think that the age factor, unfortunately, is being cut against by what you might call the Kamala Harris factor. And, Peter and I have done a lot of reporting. This is an account that I would say is coming from inside the room. These are Democrats, people who have worked closely with Kamala Harris, who are raising concerns about her. Missing in action is probably a good summary of the kinds of accounts that we've heard. Just that not stepped up, not given a rationale. It is very clear that if Biden were not to run for re-election, there would probably be a very large and robust field of Democrats who would jump into the race. She wouldn't have it to herself. You might see Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and others who would be running. Frankly, the Harris factor is going to shadow the election one way or the other, because Republicans, they didn't make too big of a deal about her in 2020, but I think the plan and the expectation is that they will be running and saying a vote for Biden is a vote for Harris, even if he is the nominee. So you're going to be hearing a lot more about Kamala Harris, I think, in the next couple years.
I had 2 people on the back on this side. One of them was Louise, I think, and then the gentleman over there. So let's start with Louise.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter and Susan, for your very interesting insights on U.S. Politics. We've been following, I work in global development, and we've been following very interesting what's happening in the U.S. with this shift in economic policy, this industrial policy, this reindustrialization of the U.S. With the CHIPS Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and just this week, the Financial Times had a very interesting article saying how is this bringing $200 billion investment in industries. But the most interesting point is that where are these investments going to? To Republican-led districts, South Carolina and Georgia. Do you think there's a possibility of this economic shift with Biden might also have an impact in voting patterns in the U.S., especially in these Republican-led districts? Thank you.
It's a great question, and it reminds us that a lot of the things that generated Donald Trump, you asked what generated Donald Trump, are some of the same sentiments that had once been the province of Democrats, right? The dwindling manufacturing base in the Midwest. Why are our jobs going to Mexico? These were concerns that used to be the main driver of certainly regional politics for Democrats in that part of the country, and Donald Trump came along and basically hijacked it and offered a much more robust version of this America First idea that we shouldn't be shipping jobs overseas, manufacturing should be revived. He didn't succeed in doing it. Manufacturing did not revive itself on his watch. He never had an industrial policy, as you put it, but Biden does. Now, does that mean that voters then give Biden and or Democrats credit for it? That's a different question. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the voting patterns in the last few years have been immune to specific policy goals, because if you were to do a lot of the analysis, which some smart experts have done in America, about who this voting group's best interest might be, in voting, sometimes it's not the person that they've been voting for. So it's a good question. It's a good question also whether the timing would be in such that it would make a difference in the next cycle. Would some of this investment be visible enough, tangible enough, create enough jobs so that people felt that their communities were different enough and that they gave credit to the president or the Democrats? That's a short time frame for that to happen in. But I do think that broadly speaking, your larger economic question, what Biden is hoping is that he's like Reagan in his first term. People forget that Reagan was at a very low point in his first midterm election. They lost a lot of seats because the economy was in terrible shape. Very high inflation at that time, high interest rates. Unemployment wasn't good. Biden has good unemployment, but what he's hoping for is, like Reagan, the economy, through its cycle and through the investments that he's tried to put into the economy, is in much better shape by the time people go to the polls, and that their mood will be better. A lot of the mood by voters is economic, and he's hoping that by the time 2024 comes around, it'll be like 1984, and America is roaring with a pretty good economy. I don't know. I'm not an economics expert. Every economist I talk to gives a completely different answer.
As usual.
As just usual, but that's what they're hoping for. They're hoping that what you're saying turns out to be true.
The gentleman there in the back.
Hi. It's okay?
Yes.
You back to polarization that you started out with. Sorry, but you make it it sounds very much like all the Republicans are this way and all the Democrats are that way, moving from the center. And having it titled, America Divided by Biden and Trump, I actually think that there are Republicans that don't like Trump, and then there are Republicans that do, and then there's Democrats that don't like Biden, and Democrats that do. And the question is, what do you think will become the development of the party system? Because I think it's antiquated and not just simply independents or not just simply, conservative or the other people that should be running. It sounds as if there's different parties within the parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it's an important one because, there are many things that Americans can agree upon, or certainly at least, a broad spectrum of Americans. There is more consensus in American society today than in our politics. And so, for example, on gun control, there are things that 80% of Americans agree upon on gun control. It doesn't happen. We can talk about why. Because you have the elected officials from one party are captured by a subset of the party's overall interests. Republicans, by and large, are just not willing at the national level or even in many state levels to support gun control measures, even those that are supported by 80% or more, 90% of their own constituents. There are a number of other issues. Abortion rights is a good example of that in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Even in many Republican states where you have had the opportunity to have referendums in places like Kansas, what you've seen is that there's a majority of voters, and that includes Republicans as well as Democrats, who are not in favor of the most radical, restrictive proposals. And in fact, national polls suggest that something like 2/3 of the American public is in favor of a pretty expansive view of abortion rights. So that's not a close call, right? That's not a close call. In the Republican Party itself, you're right. There are many Republicans who are not hardcore supporters of Donald Trump. But the problem is that there are a majority of Republicans who have been willing to vote for him and support him in 2016, in 2020, and it appears in 2024. Some people have estimated that maybe the group of, anti-Republican or non-Trump Republicans, maybe about 20 to 30% of the Republican Party as it is today. About 30% or more, though, are hardcore Trump supporters in the Republican Party today. And of course, the identity of the party has been transformed, right? So that it is more around the personality of its leader in recent years. So there are also many people who now call themselves independents who actually used to be or even are still reliable Republican voters. So it's more about the identity of the party being transformed. But I think that is one of the great tragedies that Peter and I have seen play out the last few years is the tragedy of a system that is unable to reflect common sense proposals that a vast majority of people support. Right now, by the way, and I'll leave you with this thought, there is something that Americans agree upon in a very bipartisan way. Democrats and Republicans, they agree that they don't want the 2024 election to be a contest between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Democrats and Republicans agree upon it, and yet somehow, because of the way things are, that's where we're headed.
Over there, I think I forgot about you early on, the gentleman with a hat.
We talked a lot about the threats to democracy from the right. Delineate some of the threats to democracy from the left, if you would.
In the United States? Yeah. They're not as stark at the moment. I mean, there are people on the left, as I said about, for instance, packing the court, who have ideas about revamping the system, and that you could interpret those as certainly a threat to the way things have run in the past. If we lose out on a court decision, should we then pack the court because we don't like the decision? As Susan said, that's not currently going to go anywhere. You know what I mean? Like on the right now, the willingness to blow up things is much greater and a higher level in the party. Not just Donald Trump, but the people who are following along with him, willing to do things that traditional Republicans wouldn't have done or even thought about doing just 5-10 years ago. On the left, look, I mean, there are people. There's a policy difference on the left that people won't like. There's a lot of people who think that the left, is going too far in government programs, and that government programs are too intrusive in our life. This is a traditional debate that Americans have had going back centuries, and it is an important one. What is the right balance between state and private interests in America? And there are certainly people, including some Democrats, who think that the left has gone too far right now. The divide in the Democratic Party between the progressives and the, I'm not sure what we call them, moderates. There really aren't moderates too much in any party anymore, but the progressives and the somewhat less progressives is a pretty stark one. And if it weren't for the Republican Civil War right now, we'd be looking at the Democratic Party and say, wow, that's a pretty big difference of opinion they've got there. But when push comes to shove, they've come together. In Washington last year, as bad as things got at times, as Biden was trying to push through his big legislation, in the end, they did ultimately come together. And they're not torn in the same stark, visceral way the Republicans are. And I think that the Republicans right now, the willingness to try to upend an election on January 6th, not just by the violence at the Capitol, but by voting to annul duly certified election results from states that you don't like, that's a big deal. Now, by the way, there have been Democrats who did that in the past during the George W. Bush election, where a handful of things, never by the leadership. I mean, that's what we're talking about here, is the Republican leadership now is willing to do things at the fringes. It used to be just a fringe thought. That's not the case in the Democratic side. Biden is much too much of a conventional, traditional Democrat, traditional traditional politician. This is not his nature, and most of the people who are the leadership right now, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi before them, are much more conventional politicians than you're seeing on the left, on the right. And with Kevin McCarthy willing to go along with the kind of blow up the system stuff, even though I don't think that's necessarily what he would naturally land if it was his own choice, is a sign of how much Republicans are working at the behest of the more radical elements of their party.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador?
Thank you so much from my side as well. If I may just turn to the kind of foreign policy external dimension for a second. Peter, you mentioned the different axes, and you kind of, I guess, placed the global south a bit on the kind of Brazil, China. But I guess, I mean, you will have, well, in a lack of a better word, global south. It's a quite mixed group, right? And as we see in the kind of multilateral voting, so on and so forth. And I guess the West, more than ever, will need more friends, right? Yeah. Not less. And I'm wondering, kind of these partnerships with the global south, how is that being seen in Washington? And what are the prospects also looking at what may come in 24? Thank you.
No, I think it's a very important question, and I think there's been a little bit of shock and surprise in Washington, certainly initially a year ago, that there wasn't more support for Ukraine, and there wasn't more of a rallying around outside of, the transatlantic alliance and, Western and Central Europe, very, very strong support. Then you have countries such as India or countries in the Middle East that have really stood back from the fray or been willing to continue to do business with Russia despite its revisionism. I particularly remember, as I'm sure you do, a particularly impassioned speech by Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He said, listen, none of us would have our identity as countries if this was not a principle that we supported, the territorial integrity. Remember that Russia, is seeking to annihilate Ukraine, but it's also directly attacking the basic principles that govern the international order. And yet that was not an argument that has had more effect. I thought it would with countries in Africa. Now, China, of course, in recent years has gone out of its way to build economic and foreign assistance relationships with many of those countries in recent years. They may perceive it as not in their economic interest to take too visible a side. There certainly is a large reservoir of anti-American sentiment in countries around the world. And I think Peter's point is an important one. It's one thing, if you're Kenya, not to raise your hand in support of Ukraine too vocally, but the flip side is they're not necessarily what kind of real benefit is there to Russia in that. It's been an extraordinary test of American diplomacy, right? Some of these recent leaks that we've seen, which is very serious. I was very struck by the story of Egypt, an American partner that has received how many billions of dollars of U.S. assistance over the last few decades. Basically using this as an opportunity to hold up the United States for still more concessions and aid, and saying, well, we're going to send weapons to Russia unless you give us this and that concession. Now, that was a drama that happened to play out privately until the leak of these papers. I'm sure there are many more examples. People see opportunity in this conflict, and I suppose that's the story of the world. What kind of a better deal can I get for myself, as a result of this fight between Russia and Ukraine? Countries act in self-interest, and I suppose they don't act so much in noble-sounding principles like upholding the international order or some other country's territorial integrity, which is a tragedy. But it's been revealing, I think. It is revealing. Joe Biden often talks about this moment in world affairs as the beginning of a long contest between the world's democracies and autocracies. A lot of people, including a lot of people in Europe, don't like that formulation because they see it as exclusive of countries that might not feel that they're included in that club of democracies. Or they might think, well, hey, what kind of a, is the United States such a great democracy? And, fair point. We've just been talking about that for an hour. And yet there are certain things, right, that, certain moments when choice is required. And I think what you've seen is the United States and NATO say, okay, after 20 years of screwing around, arguably with Putin, we've now made a choice. He's forced our hand. We've made a decision, and there's no point in arguing that over anymore. What I think is notable is that there's a lot of the world that hasn't yet made that choice.
And a question over there, and believe me, this is as painful to you as it is to me, but this is the last question.
So since the title of your talk is The Way Ahead, it's fair game to talk about the Kamala factor again and the second line of the Democrat and Republican Party that is more or less waiting for the oxygen to come back after Trump and Biden sucked it off and didn't allow anyone else to talk. So who are these people? What chance do they have and what do they show? And secondly, since it's about the economy, stupid, what's going to happen in regard to that and how much of an issue is that going to become in the election?
Yeah. On your first part, I can leave the economy to you. On your first part, on the Republican side, what you have basically are a series of Republicans who are trying to figure out how to be like Trump without being Trump, right? So the energy in that party is still Trumpism. Whether Trump is nominated or not, whether he goes to prison or not, the energy in that party is how do I be more like Trump? I can be, DeSantis' argument is basically, I'm Trump without the court dates, I'm Trump without having been fingerprinted and all the baggage that comes with that. But if you want things you liked about Trump, I'm here. I'm also 44 years old. Great contrast to an 80-year-old president. Come get me. I'm here ready, waiting for you. It hasn't worked for him yet, but that's the argument he's making. And I think that his strategy at this point is to wait for the second indictment, the third indictment, the fourth indictment, and then people will finally just say, okay, fine. Okay, enough. Let's go to our alternate Trump. There is no energy in that party for anybody other than a Trump-like candidate. Who are the other ones out there? Nikki Haley, Mike Pence. These guys have tried to have it both ways. They want to be both pro-Trump and anti-Trump at the same time. Nobody's buying it. They don't have a lane. They don't have a constituency. People who on the anti-Trump side don't trust them. Pro-Trump people think of them as betrayers. They have no lane. The completely anti-Trump candidates, which would be like Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson or a handful of people like that, they're zero. I mean, they're literally asterisks in the polls. There's no sense right now that there's any movement or room for people like that. So this party is not done with Trump. It may be done, let me take it this way, put it back. It may be done with Trump at some point, but it's not done with Trumpism. And so we're still just talking about grooming the next generation of Trumpists. That may change after this cycle if they go down to defeat and doesn't, and that is, as Susan says, nothing focuses a party's attention like being losers, and they have lost 7 of the last 8 presidential popular votes. At some point, even the party that loses 7 out of 8 might look at 8 out of 9 and say, okay, maybe that's a problem. The Democrats did after, a number of bad elections. On the Democratic side, you've got a whole new generation that hasn't defined themselves. The only reason Biden was the nominee was because they suddenly panicked at the idea of trying somebody new when their number one priority was getting rid of Trump, and they said, let's go with the old white dude because he seems the safest, all right? There's a lot of more progressive candidates out there who really excited a lot of Democratic voters. There were, as with Kamala Harris and others, there were some, people who would have been firsts, which were also kind of exciting to some of the voters. And in the end, when Bernie Sanders was suddenly rising in the polls during the primaries, they said, what's our priority here? Our priority is getting rid of Trump. Who's the safest guy to do it? Okay, that's Biden. Yeah, he's not exciting. Yeah, he's not, a big progressive. Yeah, he's not, he's conventional. But our biggest priority is that. So that's still their position right now. Because Trump is out there. He hasn't left the scene. He's still the threat as far as Democrats are concerned. So they're sticking with Biden. Nobody wants to do anything to undercut him, but they're all holding their breath. There is not a Democrat out there right now who's not on the payroll, and probably those on the payroll too, who's not holding their breath thinking, oh God, What are we going to do here? Now, I cover him every day, okay? I cover this White House. I've covered 5 White Houses in a row. I think Biden is obviously slower than he once was. He shuffles. It doesn't look very good. His voice is lower. He comes across. He makes gaffes. He always made gaffes. Yeah. But now the gaffes are always going to be attributed to his age, whether that's fair or not. And that's a liability for him. But I think, more or less, he's not made any decisions that I can think of right now that he wouldn't have made 10 years ago at a younger age. The question is, as Susan, I think, pointed out earlier, is do you think that's going to be true in 6 years? Because it's not enough to say, is he good enough on election day? It's, is he good enough on the next inauguration day? Because you're in the middle of a nuclear edge confrontation with Russia in the middle of Europe. You better have a president who's on his game or her game all the way to the end. Is Kamala going to be the next person? I think Susan covered that pretty well. And then you're left with a whole lot of people we don't know, right? The governors of California, Michigan, Illinois, North Carolina, New Jersey, all of them want to run for president. Pete Buttigieg wants to run again. He was the Secretary of Transportation now. Kamala obviously wants to run. None of them has the stature or the following to say, aha, that's the next one. And it doesn't mean that they won't get there. If given the room, somebody will rise to the occasion. But I watched as Bill Clinton came along, and I watched as Barack Obama came along, and you saw them 2 years out. You saw them say on the horizon, okay, I see that guy. That guy's got real talent, and he may get there. Right now, I'm not sure the Democrats are looking out on that horizon and saying that's the obvious person to look for the future.
Very well. It's past 8 o'clock. We need to close. I want to thank Flad for organizing this. I want to thank for your presence. E quero pedir desculpa àqueles que queriam fazer perguntas, mas realmente não foi possível selecionar todos. This was an absolute treat.
Well,
thank you so much, and keep up your excellent work. Thank you very much.
David. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great.
That was great.
That was great. Oh, we've got you have to answer the economy question. Thank you, guys.